Hey guys, welcome to another Bitter Butter Render tutorial. In this tutorial, I'll be showing you how to add particle systems and use them in Blender. So in this case, I'll be adding particle systems to this scene just to show you all the big main features of Blender. So first of all, when we're adding particles into Blender, we need a object called the emitter. And in this case, the best object I prefer is a plane. And then we're going to bring it up and scale them down to your preferred size. So now what we're going to do is add the particle system to our emitter object, which is the plane in this case. So to find the particle systems, where it will be located on the right hand side in this menu. So we're going to click on this button called the particle properties, and we're going to add a new particle system. And now crazy stuff happened. In your scene, these circle things that happen are called halos, and in your scene they're probably tiny, but it will be really large in my scenes because of some customization things I did. So what we're going to do is, to keep ourselves organized, we're going to always name our systems. And now there are two options here that is very important in particle systems: the emitter and the hair. So the emitter is used for creating objects or particles that move around. For in this case, you can see that these particles keep getting emitted and they move around or fall down and have physics to it. While when you're doing hair particles, you can see that it's created strands of hairs, where later on you can swap the hairs for other objects such as rocks. So this hair particle system is very useful for spreading rocks around the surface or stuff like that. But in this case, let's say we want to create a particles such as bubbles, and that's what we will do. We're going to have to use emitter because bubbles are being emitted. They're not just solid objects staying there. And right now we've gotten something called halos, and we need to swap these halos with the objects that you want to swap around. So in this case, we've gotten these bubbles that I've created and added them as a collection. So it's just a bunch of bubbles in a collection. Then you have to scroll all the way down, go into this render section, and change the render as into a collection or object. If you have a single mesh, you choose object, but if you have a bunch of meshes, you have to choose collection and choose the collection in the instance collection or instance object, depending on what you chose, and choose the collection that you put all your wanted objects in. Okay, so now if you actually wanted to scatter stuff around such as rocks and you're in the hair section, you're gonna want to do the same thing. Go into the render section, choose collection or object, and choose the object or collection that you want to render as. And see, this is what I meant. Since we chose the hair, it scatters stuff around. But we're creating bubbles and we don't want that. So now you can see something that these objects or particles that we created fall down crazily. And in this case, if this is what you want, go ahead. But what we do want is for them to float up, or we need to change how they move. So first of all, one issue is the scale, and that can be found in the render settings as always. And over here, this scale value in the render properties, you can see that this has 0.05, meaning it is 0.05% of our original object that we instanced to be particles. But we want it to be a ratio of 1:1, meaning we change the scale to 1. Okay, so now we have gotten particles moving around. But one thing is that we need to change the amount. If you want to change the amount of particles there are, since in this case there's a lot of particles, you have to go all the way up into the emission section. It will be the top part, and you can change all these settings. So first of all, we're going to change it to something around 20. Just mess around and see what you like. Okay, so now we need to change the way your particles react. Maybe you're simulating an earthquake and you have rocks that move around. They're heavier, they move around less slower, they're more rougher, they have more friction. But in this case, they're bubbles and they kind of float up. So one way we can simulate this is by going all the way down into something called field weights, and you can open up the field weights tab, and that's where all the particles physics are in. You can change the magnetic force and all that, but one main setting that you will need to change is the gravity amount. Since we want our particles or the bubbles to float up, we can change it into something around a negative value, something around negative 0.004. That's what I found to be nice. Now you can see that the bubbles are shooting out very fast. This took me a little while to figure out, but if you're amount of gravity isn't working properly, you can always go all the way up into something called velocity and change the normal amount, which is 1 meter per second. So kind of like the distance to 0.01. That's what I find. You can always mess around and see what fits best for you. And you can see that we've gotten the bubbles. So in the particles, since our emitter object is just a plane and it has no sense of what objects are inside it and all that, we have some issues. And those issues is that some of the particles can kind of go through our actual mesh that we wanted, which is, in this case, is the soap box and the soap itself. And the way we can fix that is by changing the shape of the plane itself. Obviously we can boolean it and all that, but that's kind of complicated, especially for a simple task like this. So the best way is to go into the top view so we get a better view. Click tab and subdivide it a little so we have a more flexibility of deleting the faces that we want. So maybe a subdivision value of this should be fine. And then we just have to delete the faces in face select mode on which ones you don't want, the faces that are near your object. And you can delete faces. Okay, another thing is that yes, the topology of this is very messed up because we have these random edges sticking out, but don't worry because these will be hidden later on. So now there are a few other settings. In this case, in the render section, let's say you've added rocks, all the scale of them aren't going to be the same. In this case, I do have created a collection with different scales of our bubbles. But let's say we only had one bubble to be instanced and we've set it to object and we've instanced the bubble as a single object. You can see that the scale is gonna be the same, right? And bubbles or any object in reality, such as rocks, they're not the same scale. And how we can change that is with that scale ratio. There's also something called scale randomness, and this amount changes the randomness of the bubble. So if we go with a value of 1, it's gonna change it way too much. I don't prefer going too much, but maybe somewhere around a value of 0.7 should look good. And now you can see that we're getting bubbles of different sizes. And also there is a rotation section. Since this is a sphere, it won't change our point of view of the bubbles since the texture is more see-through and all that. But if you had objects like rocks, you would have to click rotation and you can randomize the rotation and all that. So another thing is something called particle lifetime, right? So how much frames the particles last. You can see that some of the frames do kind of end in between before it kind of gets out of view. And we can change that all the way into the emission section. And that's where we have the number, which we've already changed. We got frame start, frame end, and the lifetime. These three are the stuff that we need to change now. Now, frame start is, you can set it to whatever amount of frames you have over here, or you have as your start frame, and you can change the end frame to whatever amount of frames you ended at. So maybe 120 for me, and the frame start to be 12 in my case. And then the lifetime is how much frames the particle lasts. So don't get mixed up with the end frame and the lifetime. The end frame is kind of how long the emission lasts. So until this amount of frames, it'll keep emitting or giving out or adding more particles. But the lifetime is how much frames each particle lasts. So maybe if we go with 70, now each particles won't disappear until it reaches 70 frames as its lifetime. And by the way, if you can still see the emitter while rendering, you can always go into the render section and untick show emitter. So that was it for today's tutorial. I hope you learned the basics of particle systems, and I'll see you in the next one.
Organic good.